Welcome to the Hot Politics Lab End of the Year edition. I'm Gijs Schumacher.
And I am Bert Bakker. The Hot Politics Lab is a political psychology lab at the University of Amsterdam. And our mission is to use insights from political psychology to understand big themes in politics, like populism, polarization, and other important topics.
We're a team of 3 people. Me, Bert Bakker, and Matthijs Rodan, and a lot of other PhD students and postdocs and like-minded people who visit our lab every week. We have open labs since the pandemic, and in this particular podcast, we want to give you an overview of the highlights that we've seen in our lab over the last year. We will also throw in some of our own work because, usually we don't really present that. And we do think, it's interesting, of course. It's our own work. If you want to listen to any of our podcasts, you can do so on YouTube and on Spotify. Now, 2020, of course, has been a super crazy year for all of us. Bert, what do you think was the biggest change in this year for our lab?
Well, obviously that we don't see each other in person that much anymore, and actually but the biggest change in the lab is actually that we have opened up the lab. We've moved it online, and it's accessible for a lot of people from around the world. So maybe a bit of history. When the Netherlands went into full lockdown in early March, Gijs and I were talking on the phone and said, well, what should we do? We had a series of speakers lined up for the rest of the spring. And we think, well, should we just cancel and not have any activities anymore? And this was kind of the default reaction at most of the other sort of seminar series at the university, and I think also at other universities. And we said, well, maybe it's actually fun to try to have an online open lab and invite speakers from the Netherlands, but also broader, to come and give talks, and also open up the lab for people from other places to participate. And I think that's been the biggest change we've made this year, is that it's not a closed group of people that meets in a small room in the University of Amsterdam, but it's actually an online platform.
Yeah, we've had people from the United States joining us, from the UK, Germany. On average, we've had 30 to 40 people joining us on Friday afternoons, despite the major time differences. Sometimes it's specifically speakers from California.
And also I think, in our, how many people would show up in a normal lab session? 10, 15? So, that's like 30, 40 is obviously for an average seminar actually a good size. I've spoken to a lot emptier rooms in other in various places, including my own university.
And of course, one of the major benefits is that we get to speak to people we normally don't interact with, or once a year on this conference where we meet each other. But now, big players in the field can just join our meeting and give feedback to our PhD students, and that has been an awesome experience, I must say.
Yeah, and I think I think the first period we've reached out mostly to people that we knew a little bit or a little better in some cases, but it's also been interesting to see that if we just invite people, most people that we wrote an email to that we didn't know, it's like, hey, we're a lab and interested in this and this, and would you like to come and speak? Most people are like, sure, I can do this. I think we have had very few people that say I can't make this, and also because I guess the cost of a 1 hour lab session are a lot less invasive for your private life, the rest of your activities, than that you have even if you're in other places in the Netherlands. If you would have to come to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, to our lab in Amsterdam, it costs you half an afternoon quickly.
Yeah, and you don't need to fly. It's good for your global footprint, your carbon footprint, and it also it's much more an opportunity for people on much smaller budgets, also for graduate students to interact with, to see talks and to give talks. We also have Graduate Fridays, for example, where PhD students can give talks. But Bert, what do you think are the I mean, this almost sounds too perfect to be true, but what do you think are the downsides?
Yeah, I think obviously the big downside is that we cannot have drinks afterwards. But aside from that, I think the biggest downside is that some of the informal networking, the informal conversations before the talk, after the talk, they are gone. So it's a little cleaner in a sense. Somebody comes in, you meet 5 minutes before the session starts. You have a little chit chat. Person gives a 20-30 minute talk. There an X number of questions, and then that's it. And I think this is especially for more junior researchers and also those affiliated in our lab who are like PhD students or master students. They miss out on some of the these smaller interactions that could come up in the corridor over coffee before the talk or after the talk. And we've been trying to facilitate this a little bit, and I think we've succeeded in the second half of the year when we said, well, we invite people from 3 to 4 in Amsterdam time, but we also, especially for the graduate students in our lab, we offer them the opportunity to meet one-on-one or two-on-one after the talk online. And I think that has helped to create a bit more informal networking, mentoring opportunities for the graduate students. I think that's for me, seems to be the biggest downside at the moment. That's the biggest risk. Like for you and me, this might be a little less of an issue in the sense that you have a little bit of a network, and you also know that maybe in 2 years you have the chance to talk to these people again. Mm-hmm. But if you're a second year PhD student, that interaction might actually be really important at that moment in time. Yeah. So, do you see any other downsides?
I think, well, people have said that the online format might be more suited for some people than for other people, and that creates also hierarchies. I'm not so sure about this argument though. I think so. Clearly there are more extroverted people. But I think the barrier that for an online presentation is much lower than the barrier for a conference presentation. You do obviously miss out on, say, the more chance events, right? The chance event that you get to speak to someone important in the field because you bump into each other in the elevator. The chance event of actually going to a panel you weren't planning to go to and see something really interesting. I mean, this has happened to me. I always lose my way at the MPSA Chicago, the Palmer House hotel. So it's a bit more. It needs more planning and more organization.
I think there's, for both online as well as offline, some people might enjoy giving these talks and the social parts of it a little more than others. Yeah. I think there's also maybe people that are more in the sort of regular speaker series. Yeah. They get invited or they invite themselves. I think what we've been doing is actually trying to reach out to people we find interesting. And
no one has invited himself or herself yet.
No, I don't think so.
We're open to it. Don't be shy.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that this might be, but yeah, I think I do remember the first few times teaching online, and also these first sort of seminar sessions we had in the lab. It felt a bit weird to talk to a screen, but nowadays I think it's perfectly normal to talk to a screen. Yeah. And so you also get, after a bit of time, it becomes a very normal session. I think one of the upsides that we didn't discuss is that in the format we use, where we have the participants can ask questions, but they have to write it in the chat, we get much more focused questions and much less unfocused rants.
So for the people not regularly following us, usually participants can ask questions by writing them to us, and we read them aloud. But that's not happening here. This is just us in a room full of Lego and a few beers. So there are no participants now. But indeed, and I wonder how this will... I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, maybe people do really want to ask their question like with their voice and their face, and not just with their words. But if, for one thing, we can cover a lot more questions because we simply spend a lot less time on posing them. So that's been a benefit, and I'm really curious how we'll actually practically do this once we go out of semi-pseudo intelligence lockdown, as we call it here in the Netherlands, and go to a hybrid situation where some of us will be in a room together.
Yeah, maybe we have to force people to write down their questions on a card and then we read it out.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
But we all know these persons those that should not be named in a podcast that give these long rants or have this more of a comment than a question. Yes. And we that's been completely removed in this format.
Exactly. Although I'm still curious about the one person that we're not going to name, how he or she, let's not give any clues, will behave in this situation. I mean, I literally got a 30-minute question. It was more like a sermon in response to my presentation. My presentation was only 10 minutes, by the way. And he or she has been to the lab once, but I don't think there was a question. So no, I think the format just didn't fit.
No, but in that sense, it does. I could also see that it maybe there's less of a barrier for junior people to speak up and ask a question if you can type it, rather than in a 40 people seminar room you have to stand up and you know that these and these famous professors are there.
And technically you can join us as anonymous attendees.
Yeah, you're right.
And we've had anonymous attendees, or maybe it's one person or more, we don't know. It's the mystery of our show. Yeah.
So I think, to summarize, I think the big advantage for us has actually been that with our external speaker series, we might have like twice a year have an external guest, and now we've had external guests almost weekly. Yeah. We've also had people from the University of Amsterdam, but a lot of external guests from all over the world, and it has really, I think, enriched our seminar series a lot. And but so Gijs, if you reflect on this on sort of the March till December period, what are some of the things that you remind as sort of talks that stood out, or findings that you found like, hey, that's interesting?
Yeah, let's talk about the speakers. I think the first meeting was the second or third week of March. We all just went into lockdown. Things went pretty quickly. And we had a super interesting talk by Michael Bank-Petersen from Aarhus University on anxious optimism, and this was a Corona talk, right? So the first couple of talks were really also about our own anxieties about COVID and trying to get speakers to shed some light from the social sciences on how we should advise the government to get into action. And Michael's call for anxious optimism, it was really a call for government communication to, on the one hand, make people anxious, right? To make sure that they comply, make sure that they're scared of COVID. And on the other hand, give them a perspective. So that's the optimism part. Give them a perspective of how long this is going to take, what numbers we should be looking at, and what I think was really nice about this is that it was very well informed by political psychology research, decision science research, and at the same time pretty much completely the opposite of what most governments, at least in Western Europe, were doing. First, and the most important part was in the anxious part. I mean, in half March, the government was still saying, don't worry too much, right? And they weren't giving us particular details at all. something like, yeah, okay, we've picked up a couple of cases of COVID, but there was really no serious testing at the time. So it was really the opposite recommendation to the government than what they were pursuing up to that point, and that made it, I think, very powerful. And if I reflect back on that talk and look at what the government is doing now, yeah, it looks a bit more like anxious optimism, but. Yeah, currently the optimism is kind of gone. And it's
for the listeners from other countries, the Dutch are we've just passed our second wave and we're sliding into a third, as it looks like right now.
Yeah. Okay, so other talks. Stuart Soroka, I think that was the week after. It was a super interesting talk. Really already a mix of talking about COVID, but also talking about. But his work and primarily his recent work on the negativity bias, and what I think was particularly interesting because I experienced this myself, is that so on average people have sort of a preference for negative news because if the norm is positive. Then for news to have an impact, it needs to be norm deviating, right? So it needs to be negative. But Stuart was saying, what happens if we shift the norm, and the norm is shifting currently because it's still pretty much 2020 is the bad news year of the century, and so with bad news being the norm, suddenly the norm deviating news is good news. And, I look at the newspaper every day hoping to read some good news.
How is that turning out?
I'm totally, maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I'm totally living Stuart Soroka's prediction. And I'm hoping he's turning this project into something, some really nice publication. What about you, Bert?
Yeah, I think, one of the project, obviously we've Western Europe and the Dutch in particular pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the United States, and it's not only Trump, but we've also obviously been paying attention to COVID in the United States, and Shanna Gadarian's work on COVID has obviously been very informative on this, showing relatively big partisan differences in the spring with all sorts of compliance, and they're not the only ones doing this, but they were definitely among the first to document this, and they've continuously been able to document this. And I think one of the interesting things about their project is that they what started as a first wave became like a multiple wave project, and I think it's turning into a book in the long run, and I think it's going to be very informative in a way of following as a pandemic develops, to have political scientists in a very polarized country track how with such different elite cues, right? The Republicans and especially Trump for a long period of time downplaying it or neglecting it or giving very clear cues you should not wear masks, and on the other hand the Democrats giving a different signs, and how people respond to that. I think that's obviously interesting in terms of COVID, but also interesting in terms of broader political psychological phenomena that we're interested in. Mm-hmm. And that obviously also leads to one of the other questions that I think that this pandemic has been showing us, is that how easy or difficult it is to do social scientific research in a fast moving environment.
Yeah. We've had our own bloopers.
Right, Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Pass it to me. Well, where to start? This is a story without an end yet, so maybe in the end it won't be so much of a blooper. But obviously, I think like many people, we were motivated to chip in and contribute to giving advice on communication, and so we have a bit of a research line on tailoring communication to personality, right? So think about big five: personality, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and which one I remember, openness. And so we designed a few messages to specifically tailor to agreeableness, openness, and extroversion, and then we found a
the goal of creating compliance with government policies.
Yeah, so we were interested in increasing that exactly, and then we found a research company. We won't name it here, but who would do the survey, and without giving too many details, a lot went wrong with the implementation of the survey. That's one. It essentially went into the field before we said yes, and then it was actually in the field at a time that the treatments we had written had become pretty irrelevant, right? So I think one of the things we wrote is like, don't go on weekend trips to your family. But when it was fielded, it was June. And in June, I mean, hordes of Dutch tourists were already flocking to the Spanish beaches. So, I mean, this treatment had become irrelevant. And, well, we had meant to rewrite it, but, okay, so something went wrong there. And then, some stuff went wrong also with the data analysis initially. That was just my fault. But yeah, it's also we're trying to do fast science also in a period where we were all very much time pressured because of families also being at home, right? So it's but yeah, that shouldn't be an excuse. But it definitely, this whole thing, it makes me, on the one hand, I think social science should be capable of responding in a pandemic. It should be capable of doing fast science. On the other hand, also see pretty big limitations, and maybe we should somehow prepare better for this the next time.
Yeah, I think it's also, at least, and maybe some other social scientists are maybe doing this more often, but I guess for us, our research lines are not always so one-on-one tied to societal changes. It's not like we see societal change X, like we see deep fakes coming up, let's study them. I think that's not how both our lines are developing, and so we're also not so used to it. I think the pandemic obviously is a very unusual case because we had very limited time with daycares and kids at home, and daycare closed, kids at home. But I think, in the end, I think we've also learned, it might be a little costly to say we've learned from something that has failed relatively substantively. But on the other hand, it might also be something that if we never have done it, we would have also not had these experiences. I think if I look back on it, I think we could have probably been a little sharper in terms of evaluating whether or not we should go in the field with these treatments, or, maybe that we could have probably pushed ourselves to be a little more self-critical, but on the other hand, to give ourselves some slack, we might have also we're pretty happy that we were sort of done with the experimental design, and let's just let the research company deal with it. And so there's pros and cons to it, but yeah, I think the fastness of we should be able to answer social questions fast, but I do think we need to think seriously about the checks and balances within our research team, and that's not only about sort of the statistical analysis, but also about the design and the implementation. And I think that's where we definitely missed some things.
Yeah. At the same time, I think one positive experience here for me, which has nothing to do with fast science, but is to think about your effect sizes. In political science, there's not really a tradition of thinking systematically about effect sizes. And in psychology, there's more of a tradition of that, though. But in this particular case, so in the end, we did find a very tiny effect of one of the agreeableness messages. But what does it mean to find such a very small effect? One might say, well, this effect is so small, it doesn't really matter. At the same time, if you would send that message to an entire population, and you would do the multiplication. You would find, okay, maybe 1,000 people of the 17 million or so in the Netherlands. Our effect is actually larger than that, but say it's just 1,000 people. 1,000 people are affected by this, and they start to, in the sense that they comply more than they otherwise should have done. Then that could actually save another 1,000 people from getting corona, right? So it's and maybe it would save 10 people from getting into the hospital or dying. It's very small, but it still might be relevant in that sense.
Yeah. So I think we should also, we're writing up that paper. I don't know if we're probably going to end up as a preprint on a server rather than that we go through trying to convince the journals about mostly no findings. But I think that's indeed a big takeaway that we can do, that we can take home more. It's like what indeed are the implications of what we're doing. And in that sense, the pandemic was a nice way to think about this, because we actually had some more behavioral intentions rather than attitudes or something like that we often study.
Yeah. Okay, so after a while the anxiety decreased a bit, of course, and we had time to reflect upon other things in the lab too, and we were also kind of sick of talking about corona, to be honest. So we started covering broader topics, and one clear underlying topic, although we didn't really discuss it directly, but a lot of the talks had relevant things to say about the American elections and how to understand them. And so let's talk a little bit about what we learned from those presentations.
Yes, Gijs, we've been very fortunate to have some very interesting speakers on political psychological explanations of some of the phenomena we see in American politics, but obviously also translate to other parts of the world. So a couple of talks that stand out, I think, is Chris Federico of the University of Minnesota, who is doing work on collective narcissism, which is sort of the belief that your country deserves a special treatment, and that Chris showed is positively related to nationalism, and this is part of a bigger project that he is doing with collaborators on collective narcissism, and I think it's a it's a fascinating concept, right? That you think your country is the unique country, and
the data weren't limited at all to the United States.
No. It's Poland, and I think I don't know I think a lot of Dutch people would also fall for collective narcissism. Our former prime minister was proud of our East Indian Trading Company, and we're a special country in the EU that deserves all sorts of special treatments, and so I think it's a fascinating psychological concept that has big implications for politics related to narcissism, but probably also related to other outcomes. Another timely talk we had was from Stephen Webster from the University of Indiana, who just published his book on the role of anger in politics, and done a lot of interesting studies on the extent to which politics elicit anger, and how that in turn motivates things like distrust in political elites and institutions. And that is obviously not limited to the United States, but that is Stephen's work is focused on American politics, but this is a phenomena that we can translate to Western Europe easily, and has been on our mind obviously a lot, because we're working also with Isabella, one of the PhD students, on trying to figure out what the causes of political emotions are. So that's been really fun. Yeah. Are some talks that come to mind that you thought that stood out?
I loved Ashley Jardina's talk. She's from Duke University, right? Mm-hmm. And she spoke just before or after the American elections, and her topic is the role of white identity in politics, pretty much focused on the United States. And it was really nice how she shows that white identity appeals influence politics in all kinds of different ways. That they set different norms, and this was really good talk, and very timely, of course. Another speaker I was super excited to have is Agneta Fischer. She's the dean of our faculty, but
Gijs is not forced to per se say this right now.
No.
He's not up for promotion.
I'm hoping I still am at one point, but no. I mean, I think let's not go in there. But she's more than a dean. She's an expert in the emotion science, a psychologist, and very interestingly, she's gotten interested into politics. So, political science, not doing politics, but. And so she gave a talk about the relationship between populism and fear, and this is part of a much larger project that she's doing. And this was super interesting to see how, someone with a background in emotion psychology is trying to, enrich in the field of populism, which typically hasn't focused at all on emotions. So on. So those were there were many more exciting talks, but these were the talks that I think were particularly relevant. If you think about the American elections, which obviously has dominated the sort of the election agenda this year. Although I think we do missed one particularly interesting election in New Zealand. The
Labour landslide win.
Just in the Ardern, with I think the first majority since they moved to a sort of mixed electoral system, which I think is probably only happened like once or twice in the electoral history of this sort of electoral system. So that's super interesting. But in an American presidential election year, everything is pretty much. All the other election news is pretty much on a different scale.
I'm actually I actually follow her on Facebook. Because some people mentioned that she had that she uses the social media channels in a kind of unique way of directly speaking to with her electorate, and it's kind of interesting. I'm not listening to all of what she has to say, but it is this sort of YouTube vlogger meets politician style, which I don't see from a lot of other politicians. And it comes across authentic. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I do like her communication style. I was particularly amused by her that she said that the first time that New Zealand was corona free for 2 weeks or something, she said, I made a little dance in my house, and then my daughter, which is a baby or is the son, I don't know, looked at me funny. Yeah. So that, but going back to the American elections, we promised to talk a little bit about our own work. We haven't been able to advertise it at all on our lab. So now's the time.
Pure altruism.
Now's the time for advertisement. Okay. Let's talk about the Journal of Politics publication. What's the title? Maybe that will be
the populist appeal, anti-establishment. Communication and personality. And maybe a little history of that project is that what might actually be, when we didn't realize that the Hot Politics Lab would be founded, is in the big central hall of the Palmer House, where on the Sunday afternoon at the end of the Midwest, Matthijs Roduin and Gijs and I were talking about populism and maybe trying to see if there would be some psychological correlates of populism, and that was probably 2013 or 12, and ended with a first paper where we have some relatively we have some evidence that from a few countries that those lower on agreeableness, they who are distrusting, cynical, tough-minded, indeed support populist parties, factions more often. We had evidence from the United States, from Germany, so Die Linke, and the Netherlands, the Freedom Party, the United States, the Tea Party, sort of 2010, 2012. Now, this is an interesting paper, and it's gotten some attention in this. I think in particular in the populism literature, it gets this sort of this attention that maybe psychology also matters, or personality. But we've been for a while been thinking that we should probably do a follow-up, because we could probably broaden the number of cases that we study, but also we have a mechanism in that original paper that was published in 2016 in the European Journal of Political Research, but we don't really test it with these correlational studies. So in the past years, we have been collecting as many sort of observational studies that we could find, and these are all sort of publicly available data sets from different countries, ranging from countries with right-wing populist parties such as Switzerland and Denmark, the Danish People's Party, the Netherlands, the Freedom Party, UK with UKIP, but also more countries with left-wing progressive parties with a populist signature. So Spain with Podemos, and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and in Germany with both Die Linke and the Alternative for Deutschland. So we had a more diverse range of countries, so that we could test, do we see indeed that those lower on agreeableness, who are distrusting, cynical, tough-minded, are indeed more likely to vote for these populist politicians who portray the elites as self-centered, cynical, as corrupt. And so we across these X number of countries and X number of samples, we pretty consistently replicate that pattern that we documented earlier. And then we did in 2016 already, we did a conjoined experiment in the United States. And so to test more of the mechanism of indeed politicians that portray an anti-establishment message also get more votes from those lower on agreeableness. And the beauty of a conjoined experiment is that we could vary the populist rhetoric, so portraying elites in Washington as self-centered, evil and corrupt or not. But we could also at the same time vary the ideological positions of these parties. So they could be pro or anti-establishment, could be pro or anti-immigration, they could be pro or pro-welfare redistribution or not. We could vary their background. So we have a bunch of different profiles that people see, and we every time ask them, like, which politician would you like to vote for? And we indeed find that those lower on agreeableness, they give more votes to politicians with a anti-establishment message versus a pro-establishment message. So that's kind of a nice additional piece of evidence. That's the one route to populism support that is prominent in there. I think we have a nice second route to populism support that is a little bit hidden maybe also in the paper, but it should get attention. So pay attention, listener. There's obviously also been the idea that populists are motivating. That's the turn to authoritarianism, and this sort of older concept that those higher on authoritarianism prefer order and structure and dominance. And so what we find in our observational study, so across a couple of these countries where measures of authoritarianism are included, so we do use these child rearing values. So do you like your children to be ordered and structured and obey you, or can they be free and run around playfully? And we find that actually it's mostly the right-wing signature, so right-wing parties, that get more votes from those higher on authoritarianism. And in the conjoined experiment, we actually have a nicer way of testing that second mechanism. So we find no evidence that authoritarianism moderates that reliance on that anti-establishment message versus pro-establishment message, but the higher authoritarian give more votes to politicians with an anti-immigration agenda. And that, I think, gives a nice example of how psychological traits can have different routes to support for politicians. So agreeableness works via the anti-establishment activation, while authoritarianism much more likely works via the activation of threat in sort of the ideological positions of anti-groups that threaten you. I think it's a nice paper that should indeed get some attention.
And I think it's also important to note that populism is typically conceived as having two components, right? Anti-establishment and people-centrism. And we also show in particular that it's this anti-establishment aspect that works with agreeableness, and not so much as people-centrism. The people-centrism is typically the part that that populist parties are disliked for, or very much liked for, maybe, because it's the more, to put it differently, it's the more controversial part, because that's the part where they define what the people is and who isn't.
Yeah. The
right?
Common good.
Yes, exactly. The white people, or the original people, or whatever. But it can also have a left wing interpretation, like the workers, or ordinary people versus bankers. But so this anti-establishment component that we've looked at is obviously a very important aspect of American politics. I mean, it's pretty much every candidate except for Joe Biden in the last 20 years has said that they were an anti-establishment candidate. Mm-hmm. I mean, even Barack Obama promised to bring a different perspective to Washington, and John McCain did that. George Bush did that. Needless to say, Donald Trump did that. This anti-establishment attitude is an aspect of populism that also definitely has a different connotation than.
And I think it's also fair to say, I think two things that stand out in the paper as well. I think we're realistic about the effect sizes there. It's not that if we know somebody's level of agreeableness that we can one-on-one predict what your probability, whether or not you vote for a populist or not. And the second thing that I think stands out in the paper is that we don't try to characterize people as good or bad. I think we there's a lot of advantages in politics, but also outside of politics, to be a little lower on agreeableness. Like, being a little bit more distrustful and cynical about the intentions of others also means you might not get exploited so much. And we know from other people's work that those lower on agreeableness speak up in political meetings. They protest more. These are normatively good things in democracy. So I think we should be careful of putting too much normative implications on what it means to be lower on agreeableness, which some people have criticized some of our earlier work on agreeableness and populism for.
Yeah. Hey, moving to some other work, maybe the foundational paper of the Hot Politics Lab, because the paper is called Hot Politics ? Over times we've questioned maybe whether we should rename the lab to Cool Politics Lab, but now we actually do have some hot findings. A paper published this year in the American Political Science Review, again by me, Bert and Matthijs Roduin. A 4-year saga of collecting physiological data with field in the lab settings. We went to Lowlands, a music festival, an evangelical rock festival. We went to a huge fair in the Netherlands, a biker festival, and we collected data. We were interested in we showed people left wing and right wing rhetoric in terms of like really like propaganda films. So we made video clips about, say, with an anti-immigration perspective versus a pro-immigration perspective, and so people were randomly exposed to either the left wing or the right wing story, and we studied their physiological responses. Bert, you want to dive into what we looked at specifically?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think there's a set of expectations we had, and some of them they were confirmed, but others didn't.
Others were just wrong.
Yeah, that's also the process of learning. We set out with a set of expectations. One was that what we find is that those who are have more extreme political positions, which are measured before exposure to these political messages, they experience more physiological arousal, so more sweat secretion in the fingertips, find not much evidence that it's those who are more knowledgeable, which is another argument that has been made in the literature, that those who are more knowledgeable, they have more hot, their political concepts are hotter, but we find no evidence that knowledge is a predictor, statistically significant predictor of this increased physiological arousal. So that's when it comes to arousal. That's the first dimension. The second dimension is the dimension of valence, which is arousal has been used by, among others, like Stuart Soroka and Diana Mutz have used physiological arousal in some of their work. Valence is less often used in political science to our reading, and we find that obviously once we know people's pre-treatment positions, and so we know what they think about immigration, climate change, redistribution, and then they were randomly exposed to a left-wing progressive message or a right-wing conservative message. And we find that the more you disagree with the message you've received, so being pro-immigration receiving an anti-immigration message, or being anti-immigration receiving a pro-immigration message, that evokes activity of the corrugator muscle. That's the muscle just above your eyebrow, and it's been known to be activated to signal or experience negative effect. And so that fits within the motivated reasoning framework, that things you disagree with evoke negative effect. You would counter argue if we would extrapolate the theory further. So I think that are interesting findings. Also, a lot of things that we thought didn't work out. We find not much evidence that politics is funny. So we had, among a subset of our participants, we had the zygomaticus, which is a muscle known to be activated by positive effect, and we don't really find that people that agree with messages have more activation of the zygomaticus, which you would expect. Maybe we measured the zygomaticus wrong. Men with beards which is common in the Netherlands at this point in time, are hard to get the muscle needs to be there. We might have also not been completely skillful, especially sort of this lab in the fields where you are under a bit of time pressure. Do you have enough time to correctly place this on somewhere on the cheek? Well, above the eyebrow is pretty easy, and skin conductance is very easy to collect. But maybe politics isn't also funny, where we can't per se reject or accept that based on this study. I think we should do more work on that. Something other that I thought that was interesting, we had also post the treatments, we asked people again about their political positions, so we could look at some of the attitudinal change. Our sample, which is relatively large and sufficiently powered to test what we do, is like 450 people?
Yeah.
450 people. It still is not enough to test whether or not people become more extreme or more moderate in response to messages they agree or disagree with, if you would expect that from the motivated reasoning literature. So we look at absolute change, and what we do see is that these physiological, like increased arousal, is a predictor of change, which is interesting. We're not aware of work that really shows this, and it also holds controlling for some of the discrete emotions that we measured among a subsample, which is interesting. And I think the big puzzle that at least Gijs and I are interested in at the moment, one of the puzzles we're interested in, is that we find not much evidence that the physiological measures correlate with what people say they experience, which is a big puzzle of how this has been tempting to say, well, the one is more valid than the other, physiology or self-reports, but we don't really think about it in that way. The big puzzle, I think, that we are thinking about is like when is this aligning? When do people experience physiological effect, and does that align with specific emotions or not? And that our study doesn't speak to it, but we outline an agenda. And therefore, I hope that the paper would also inspire some other people to do some work on this. Yeah. There's more findings and more null findings in the paper, but these are some of them that I think are important.
So yeah, I would summarize it as, well, the two main takeaways from this study are: first, if you want to study emotions, you can study them as very cognitive and as something very much preconscious, affective. And these aren't the same things. They shouldn't be the same things, and we should look at both of them in order to get a full understanding of the very complex concept of emotion, which is just much more than just telling someone you're angry. It's much more than that. It's a huge process with unconscious and conscious aspects. And secondly, what we've shown is that there are effective responses to politics that do actually seem to matter somewhat for attitude formation. And so for me at least, I guess for you too, Bert, this was a bit of a vindication of the Hot Politics project. So we were super happy that this was accepted in such a nice journal. And so this is obviously not an end point, but rather the beginning of a large research agenda where we're further exploring these effective routes. And one particular small nice publication we just want to mention on the fly is Yikes. Yikes! Are we disgusted by politicians? Published in Politics and Life Science, where we show that people experience physiological disgust when they see pictures of out-party politicians. And so, with physiological disgust, I mean activation of the labii levator muscle that is just beside your nose. So people literally pull up their noses when they see an out-party politician. And talking again about effect sizes, the effect size of watching a person vomiting is exactly the same as the effect size of someone watching an out-party politician. Interesting footnote there as well is that if you tell people that the in-party politician, that of course we've also shown them in-party politicians, if that in-party politician has committed a moral violation, like taking bribes, then also you see almost the same effect, but then reverse. So it's the in-party that produces the physiological disgust. So again, this is entirely different than the Hot Politics paper, because now we're talking about identity, about politicians, and that none of that was in the Hot Politics paper. But again, we show some of that these responses that you can clearly find with self-reports have an effective basis. But perhaps the most interesting finding of this paper is that the correlation between people who had this physiological disgust response and people who had self-reported disgust in response to seeing the out-party politician, that correlation is 0. So it really seems that people differ in terms of which systems are activated, are working in sort of processing this information. We can't yet explain this.
What I find interesting about is that in political science, this has the tendency to maybe then turn into a discussion about which one should we use, the one or the other. But in psychology and neuroscience, this seems to be the discussion. This seems to be their fascination. Like what causes this concordance? Is there concordance? Like what I mean with concordance in a sense of alignment between your physiological and sort of more cognitive emotional discussion. And I personally think that is a fascinating discussion. And I was surprised when I started reading a little bit more of the sort of neuroscience psychology work on this, that I was like, well, this is kind of the discussion they're having right now. And they've been having for a long period of time. It's one of the fundamental discussions they have. So I hope we're not turning this into sort of a validity discussion of the measures, but it seems to be more a theoretical discussion about, what are emotions and how what parts are we measuring with the different measures we're using, and maybe they sometimes align, and that might have different consequences when they're not aligning. And that's a fascinating component that we outline in both these studies. That's actually also part of the parallel that we twice see very limited correlations between what people say and what they physiologically experience.
Yeah. And that for sure will be an important aspect of our research agenda in the next few years. And I just want to welcome everyone who's listening and wants to, exchange thoughts with us on this. To reach out, and we would be happy to discuss this and work on this jointly. But there's one more thing about this Politics and Life Sciences publication that is interesting. It was our first registered report. So for those of you unfamiliar with registered reports are you essentially write the paper before collecting the data. So you write up your hypothesis, you write up how you construct your hypothesis or the theory, you write up your data analysis section, how you're going to collect data, obviously. So it's even a step further than a pre-analysis plan. And because the registered report is also reviewed, so it is accepted results blind, and so this was a really interesting experience. Lots of things went wrong, obviously, for this being the sort of the new next thing in this open science workflow. But it has been a fascinating process for me. How was this for you, Bert?
Well, I agree. It's been. I think it's. The journal Politics and Life Sciences should be applauded for also offering this format. I think there's still not a lot of journals that offer this in political science, in communication, and in psychology, and they're growing numbers. But I think a couple of things really stand out, and maybe start with sort of the design phase. I remember the conversations we had. I think it was probably in spring 2019 when we're writing this, if memory serves me well. Maybe it's even earlier, but we were with pre-registration in general, but with registered reports in particular, you become so incredibly precise about what are the theoretical puzzle you want to address, what hypothesis do you formulate, and what is the design that fits with that. And I think I think that has made our conversations much more precise about what we're doing, rather than sitting in an office or in a Zoom meeting about sort of speculating about things that could be interesting to study and what's the design. We're now really thinking through what's the hypothesis and does this design actually allow you.
I think pretty far into the process, we realized that the hypotheses we had formulated weren't actually tested by the analysis plan. And we might be stupid, but I actually think this happens to a lot of people. I mean, and we should be open about this.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest takeaway from the first stage, and it also made us more selective in. We're also only collecting the data we need to test our hypothesis, and that's nice because you're not sort of preparing for all sorts of additional comments or robustness checks that you anticipate. It's like, now this is the design. I think the other part that we realized is that we wrote a very extensive stage 1 submission, and then we had to program the protocol. And I think we should have probably programmed the protocol when we were writing the stage 1 submission, because it was so detailed, but there was so much information that we also just made some human errors. That because somewhere on page 22 something was hidden about like block randomization that we in the end didn't implement. So I think going forward, and this is obviously easier in Qualtrics when your design is easier than in a physiological study where the programming and all credits should actually also be given to our co-author Maaike Homan, who did a lot of the programming and should not be blamed for the mistakes. But I think what we should have done at that point, once we're writing stage 1, we should have programmed the protocol as well, and that would have made sure that we have everything on our mind. But now you send it out stage 1, 3 months go out for revisions, and then you have to program it. And I think it was 35 pages or something with text. So at some point you miss something, and I think that's one of the parts where the pre-analysis plan failed in sort of planning.
And lots of these experiences we had, but we used them to sort of rewrite our recommendations regarding how to write pre-analysis plans and registered reports. And if you're interested in that, you can find it on our website. we have specific recommendations, and feel free to use them or send an email if you have comments on it. Because this is so much a work in process. I mean, it's great to be doing open science, but there's just so many things we're all still figuring out as to what is the best way to go.
Yeah, so what I particularly like also about this registered report, we have this table in the main text, sort of deviations from the stage 1 registration. And if anything that has influenced me this year was the Nature Human Behavior editorial titled "Tell It Like It Is." And I think that they where they stimulate researchers to not tell the story that fits the data, but to actually tell the story that reflects the research process. And for me, and I think for all three of us, getting that table 1 in is like, well, here are deviations. It's also the standard of what people want in registered reports, but it also shows like, here are the deviations, and we also discuss whether or not they're detrimental for the interpretation of our results. And I think that it outlines a way of transparency that about the research process, that we've had these ideas, we forgot some of it was just different because the data looked different, some things were analytical decisions, and here they are, and you as reader can go to the paper and evaluate whether or not you believe our results. And I think that's the amount of transparency that also helps to increase credibility of science in general.
Yeah. Talk about deviations. I mean, I wrote NHB, Nature Human Behavior paper in our discussion points here, but I actually wanted to talk about our Nature Human Behavior paper, which was accepted in 2019, but officially published in 2020. Yeah. There we it's titled "Conservatives and Liberals Have Similar Physiological Responses to Threats," and it's a co-authored paper with between Bert, me, and Finn Arsenault and Claire Gautreaux, and it's a replication of an existing paper from 2008, Oakley et al., where they show that conservatives have stronger physiological responses to threats than liberals. It's mostly skin conductance. So it's arousal differences, and in our paper, but there are now 2 or 3 other papers that show exactly the same. We find absolutely no evidence that this is the case, and for me, this was personally a huge step forward on, say, the open science agenda. Part of this was also sort of pre-analysis plan. Some of it wasn't. But the benefit of replication and to pinning down a priori what you are going to show has, for me, been sort of an eye-opener. What was also an eye-opener, I think, was the attitude of the original authors, in particular Kevin Smith, about being super honest and transparent about what they had been doing, and also very supportive, actually, in getting our work out. So this is a big shout-out for Kevin.
Yeah, and I think also it's also a big shout out to the other Kevin Arsenault, whom I was just tonight had a bit of contact with him about I did my Marie Curie Global Fellowship, a 2-year postdoctoral project where 1 year was with Finn in Philadelphia, and the second year was back in Amsterdam. And one of the first evenings I was in Philadelphia, Finn and I went out for dinner, and we started to plan a little bit some of the physiological work we wanted to do, and it turned out into a conversation about open science and about sort of this. The end of the dinner, we're like, you know what, we should probably commit to just pre-register everything we're going to do in the lab, and that commitment in September 2017 has really changed the way that I do my work nowadays, and I think that is also the decision to pre-register the replication has been a consequence of that dinner conversation, and has really helped to give it credibility with the immense amount of robustness checks we replicated there. I think we've both shied away a little bit from some of the other sort of more, once we're not doing replications, we're pre-registering less robustness checks because they all need to be reported. And but for the replication, it was an incredible strength to say, if you want to salvage this idea that conservatives are more threat sensitive than liberals, does it matter if you subset it on sophistication? Does it matter if you subset it on race? Does it matter if you subset it on gender, on age? And all these findings that we have in a very extensive appendix just show exactly the same pattern over and over again. And yeah, I think the pre-registering procedures there has been incredibly helpful, and also in terms of specificity about the idea. I think that's the other part that I think about both registered reports and pre-registration help, is that your ideas in terms of replication or original just become much sharper. And so I think a lot of people I think you shouldn't do open science because you want to be part of what you think is maybe something that cool kids or just general the discipline expects you to do. I think you want to engage in things like replication and pre-registration because it makes your work better. Yeah. And that's an intrinsic motivation.
Absolutely. Still, for me personally, open science to me isn't about the forms. It isn't about pinning down researchers, but a lot of people think like, there is no more space for creativity or exploration. It's rather about honesty and transparency, just by, what hypothesis testing in your paper is just exploratory and what was conceived prior to doing the analysis. And I think, it's such a simple distinction, but I think it makes a world of difference in how we write papers and how we talk about papers and how we talk on large, even about careers, right? So it's for me that's a huge eye opener that I can recommend everyone to.
Also, I think it's one of the few things we have as scientists in the 21st century where everybody can have an opinion about anything, and so I think we can bring in facts, but they should be derived based on open and transparent procedures, and because otherwise if we're just telling stories, then we're not doing that much different than other people that don't work at universities and just spread stories on social media or whatever at dinner parties. So that I think is also, and there's been some work by Daniel Lakens that shows that open and transparent workflows increase credibility, and I think that's we've done work on populism. I think the critique of the academy and scientists in general is something we experience to some extent in the Netherlands. It's much bigger in other countries, but if we want to prepare for some of these critiques, I think we should have a open and transparent set of workflows.
All right, Bert.
Yeah, it's late.
What are you most excited about for 2020?
Yeah, this is, I think I'm most excited about the fact that there's some big puzzles laying ahead of us that I think we're not gonna solve in 2021, but I do wanna and I hope we can do some work to figure out some of it, and that's unrelated to specific papers, but trying to zoom in on the discussion of what is the role of affect in politics, but what actually is affect and what are emotions in politics. I think that's a fascinating question that I'd hope to work more on in 2021.
And I think we'll have more of that, even coming from the lab. I'm really excited about the work we're doing with Maaike Houwman about facial mimicry of politicians, which, well, shall I say it already? It's maybe not facial mimicry, but oops. Spoiler alert. Exciting work with Isabella Rebasso on how we can frame messages in such a way that they elicit anger. Exciting work coming up with us and Christian people on trying to detect emotion in politicians' speeches. I'm really looking forward to see how this develops, and obviously the project we've been talking about more or less a lot this hour, the how do discrete emotions and physiology relate, and can we predict who has which type of response. There's of course that's the research part, but also we will have a lot of more podcasts, more videos, live. You can also join us live every Friday, almost every Friday, from 3 to 4 Central European time. We are starting again in the new year on January 8th with Jif Lelkes from the University of Pennsylvania. The week after that we have Ursula Daxeker from the University of Amsterdam, and the week after that we have Leor Schmickgrot. I still have to work on the pronunciation, from the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. And at the end of that month, that's 29th of January, we have Graduate Friday. So at the end of every month, we have Graduate Fridays where PhD students can present. This time we'll have Tristan Klingelhofer from John Hopkins, and Lynn Andrea Fick from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And so if you're a grad student and you want to present in our lab, there are still some places later on in the schedule. I'm talking about May and June, always the last Friday of that month. So please contact in case you're interested to discuss there. We've got some people to thank. Right?
Yes, obviously Christian People, who is helping us with and setting up all the Zoom meetings, and obviously some sponsors. In my case, that is the Amsterdam School of Communication Research.
And in my case, it's the European Research Council and the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. And finally, I want to thank you, Bert, my partner in crime, for having so much fun with me and and having bought these excellent beers.
They're from the Gooise Brouwers, which is only locally available in Hilversum. So if you don't know that, look it up on the map. And I think we want to thank you all. Like this year, we've broadened our network and our lab has been opener, and that is only fun to do if other people also have interest in that. So we want to thank you. Please feel free to engage with us on our work, but also on the things you work on, the things our students work on, and obviously it would be fun if you attend our lab sessions and contribute to that. So we hope to see more of you in the upcoming year 2021, which I think is how the cases in the Netherlands develop. We'll have a lot more of these online versions coming. So that's a positive note to end 2020 with.
Jeez. Okay.